The high-speed black sedan screeches through the rain-slicked neon streets of Gangnam, its tires crying out against the asphalt. Suddenly, the rear door flings open and a woman in a tattered designer evening gown rolls onto the wet pavement. She doesn't check for injuries. She simply sobs, crawling toward the light of a nearby police kiosk with a desperation that chills the bone. She isn't running from a gunman or a kidnapper. She is running from a man sitting perfectly still in the shadowed back seat of that car. As the vehicle pulls away into the mist, her voice pierces the roar of the city. His eyes, he didn't even touch me, but I felt my soul breaking. This is the fourth socialite this month to flee the Untouchable Prince, Jae-Hyuk Draven Seo. In the elite glass towers of Seoul, they say Jae-Hyuk's presence is a literal curse. It isn't a matter of violence or cruelty. It's his aura. It is a psychological weight so heavy it causes physical collapse. A killing intent, so sharp it makes the very air turn to ice. They call him the Prince of Silence because his shadow alone is enough to destroy the weak. The whispers in the VIP lounges of Cheongdam-dong are always the same. Too intense, too dark, impossible to withstand. He is a man designed by trauma and power to be alone. A monster in a custom-tailored suit that no one can breathe near. Then a private jet from Accra touches down at Incheon, cutting through the winter fog. Zariah Nyamekye Agyeman steps onto the tarmac, and for a moment, the bustling airport seems to slow its pulse. She does not arrive in the rags of a beggar, despite the crushing debt that has hollowed out her family's future. She arrives in a regal emerald velvet gown, the gold embroidery at her cuffs catching the dim hanger lights like armor. Behind her lies a fallen Ghanaian dynasty and the vultures of her father's creditors. Before her lies a man the world has branded a psychological hazard. She has already signed the Mafia Vow. She has placed her thumbprint on the ancient parchment scroll tied with a black ribbon, binding her life to the prince everyone else is fleeing. As the elevator ascends to the 40th floor penthouse, the air begins to thicken. By the time the doors chime open into the marble foyer, the atmospheric pressure is enough to shatter glass. The silence of the penthouse is a living thing, cold and suffocating. Jae-Hyuk stands by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back to her, silhouetted against the glittering frozen sprawl of Seoul. The untouchable aura radiates from him in waves, a silent scream of "stay away," that has sent every other woman into a straitjacket or a casket. The average person would feel their knees buckle. They would feel the primal urge to scream and run back to the elevator. But Zariah is not average. She feels the weight pressing against her chest, the cold chilling her skin, and she simply adjusts the line of her gown. She walks forward, her heels clicking a rhythmic, defiant staccato against the black marble. She doesn't stop until she is standing in the very heart of his shadow. When Jae-Hyuk finally turns, his eyes are like shards of obsidian, dark and bottomless, waiting for the familiar flash of terror to cross her face. He expects her to tremble. He expects her to gasp for air. Instead, Zariah looks the monster directly in the eye and lets a slow, knowing smile touch her lips. The air between them crackles, a collision of two different kinds of power. She hasn't come to survive the prince. She's come to reign beside him. This isn't just a marriage. It's a sovereign war. And as the gold on her sleeves glints under the chandelier, the message is clear. A queen never bows, and this queen has just found her kingdom. The heavy silence of the penthouse was not a lack of sound. It was a physical weight, a suffocating pressure that seemed to swallow the very light from the expensive crystal chandeliers. Jae-Hyuk Draven Seo stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a silhouette of sharp, unforgiving edges against the neon heartbeat of Seoul. He did not move, yet the air around him rippled with a dark, kinetic energy, an untouchable aura, that acted as a silent predator, warning every living soul that to step closer was to risk psychological annihilation. Behind him, the massive mahogany doors creaked open. Minhee, a porcelain-skinned socialite handpicked by the Seo elders for her pedigree and poise, stood trembling in the foyer. She had been warned of the prince's silence, but she had laughed, confident that her beauty could thaw any ice. That confidence had lasted exactly 3 seconds. As she stepped into the room, the temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees. The killing intent radiating from Jae-Hyuk hit her like a physical blow to the solar plexus, stealing the oxygen from her lungs. Jae-Hyuk did not turn around. He didn't need to. He could hear her heartbeat, erratic, terrified, shallow. He felt the familiar, bitter satisfaction of his own curse. His presence was a void that consumed the weak. It was a defense mechanism forged in the fires of a childhood where he was treated as a weapon rather than a son, a trauma so deep it had manifested as this tangible, crushing field of dread. I brought the documents, Min-hee whispered, her voice cracking. She took one step forward and her vision blurred. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to elongate, twisting into monstrous shapes fueled by her own rising panic. The prince's aura didn't just intimidate. It reflected a person's deepest fears back at them. For Min-hee, it was the fear of being erased. Jae-Hyuk finally shifted his head, a fraction of an inch. His obsidian eyes caught the light, cold and devoid of any human warmth. He didn't speak a single word, yet the silent command to leave echoed in her mind with the force of a scream. The breaking point came as a sudden sharp snap. Min-hee dropped the leather portfolio, the papers scattering like fallen leaves across the marble. A soft, whimpering sound escaped her throat before she turned and bolted. Her heels clicked frantically against the floor as she fled the penthouse, her mind fracturing under the weight of a man who didn't even have to lift a finger to destroy her. Downstairs, the security detail watched with practiced indifference as yet another woman staggered out of the elevator, her eyes glazed with the look of a survivor fleeing a war zone. They had seen it all before. The Prince of Silence was a king of an empty castle, a man whose very soul was a no-fly zone. News of the flight traveled fast through the underworld. The Seo elders sat in their dim boardrooms, frustrated by the prince's inability to be tamed. They needed a bride to solidify their upcoming merger, a sacrifice to the monster they had created. But who was left? The socialites were terrified, the heiresses were in hiding, and the reputation of the Seo penthouse had become a legend of horror. In the high-stakes game of mafia politics, Jae-Hyuk was the ultimate prize, wealthy beyond measure, powerful enough to crush rivals with a phone call, and handsome in a way that felt like a trap. But what was a prize if it was untouchable? The world was convinced that the prince would end his days alone, a god of a dead empire, surrounded by gold and silence. They didn't realize that across the ocean, a different kind of power was already in motion. They didn't know that while the women of Seoul were fleeing the storm, a queen from the sun-drenched coast of Ghana was preparing to walk directly into the eye of it. For Zariah, silence wasn't something to fear. It was a space to be conquered. And the prince's aura, which had broken the minds of so many, was about to meet the one force it couldn't repel. A woman who had already looked at death and refused to blink. The descent into Incheon International Airport was a plunge into a world of chrome and ice. For Zariah Nyamekye Agyeman, the view through the window was a stark departure from the amber sunsets and bustling heat of Accra. Beneath the wings of the private jet, Seoul sprawled like a sprawling circuit board of neon blue and frozen white. She smoothed the fabric of her emerald velvet gown, the weight of the gold embroidery on her cuffs serving as a grounding reminder of who she was. She was not a fugitive seeking asylum. She was a sovereign entering a pact. The cold hit her the moment she stepped onto the tarmac, a sharp crystalline bite that sought to steal the breath from her lungs. She did not shiver. She walked with a poised, rhythmic gravity, her high ponytail swaying like a pendulum behind her. A fleet of black obsidian sedans waited, guarded by men whose faces were carved from the same granite as the city's skyscrapers. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The air of the Seo Empire was already beginning to close in around her. The drive through Gangnam was a blur of high-speed luxury and suffocating silence. Zariah watched the Latte World Tower pierce the gray sky like a needle, a monument to the wealth that had bought her family's debt. She knew the stories. She knew that in the penthouse of that very tower, a man sat in a vacuum of his own making, a prince whose untouchable aura was whispered to be a physical toxin to the weak. When the elevator doors opened on the 40th floor, the atmosphere didn't just change. It solidified. The penthouse was a masterpiece of quiet luxury, a sanctuary of black marble, white silk, and filtered shadows. But as Zariah stepped onto the polished floor, she felt the invisible wall of Jae-Hyuk Draven Seo's presence. It was a dense, vibrating pressure that pushed against her skin, a psychological weight designed to trigger the primitive flight instinct in the human brain. It was the same shadow that had sent heiresses screaming into the night, their minds fractured by the sheer intensity of a man who radiated a killing intent, as naturally as breathing. Jae-Hyuk stood at the far end of the vast living space, framed by the floor-to-ceiling windows. He wore a crisp white dress shirt, the top buttons undone, his sleeves rolled back to reveal arms built for both violence and restraint. He didn't turn. He simply waited for the sound of retreating footsteps. He waited for the gasp of terror or the sudden collapse of resolve that usually followed a woman's first encounter with his darkness. Zariah's heels clicked against the marble, the sound echoing with a terrifying steady confidence. She didn't slow down. She walked directly into the center of the storm, into the very heart of the pressure zone where the air seemed to thin and turn to frost. The closer she got, the heavier the aura became, a suffocating blanket of repressed trauma and cold authority. He finally turned, his jawline sharp enough to cut, his obsidian eyes locking onto hers with a piercing, predatory focus. He let the full weight of his presence bear down on her, a silent challenge that had broken the strongest men in the underworld. The room felt like it was shrinking, the oxygen vanishing between them. Zariah stopped 3 feet from him. She felt the aura. It was a dark, roiling tide that sought to drown her, but she did not blink. She did not tremble. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her gaze sweeping over him with the serene contemplation of a judge. She saw the untouchable prince not as a monster, but as a man hiding behind a fortress of shadow. The silence stretched, long and dangerous, until the tension in the room reached a breaking point. It was Jae-Hyuk who narrowed his eyes first, a flicker of genuine shock crossing his features. No one had ever stood this close for this long. No one had ever looked into the void of his soul and refused to look away. "You're late," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. Zariah adjusted her emerald cuff, her expression remaining poised and regal. "A queen is never late," she replied, her voice smooth and unshakable. "She arrives exactly when the kingdom is ready for her." In that moment, the power dynamic of the penthouse shifted. The untouchable aura was still there, but it had met its match. For the first time in his life, Jae-Hyuk Draven Seo wasn't the only person in the room with the power to destroy. The Ghanaian queen had arrived, and she was already measuring the dimensions of her new throne. The air in the penthouse remained thick, a dense sea of invisible tension that Zariah navigated with the grace of a seasoned voyager. Jae-Hyuk watched her from beneath dark, hooded lids, his silhouette seemingly carved from the very shadows he cast. He had expected her to break, or at least to fray at the edges, yet she stood before him like a monolith of emerald and gold. Without a word, he gestured toward the massive black marble table that dominated the center of the room. There, resting upon the cold, polished surface, lay the object that had brought them together. An aged parchment scroll, its edges yellowed by time and weighted with the gravity of generations. It was bound tightly by a silk black ribbon, a stark contrast against the cream-colored vellum. This was the Mafia Vow, a relic of the Seo Clan's ancient customs that bridged the gap between modern corporate dominance and old-world blood oaths. Jae-Hyuk moved with a predatory smoothness, his white dress shirt stark against the dim lighting as he reached for the ribbon. His fingers, long and scarred with stories he didn't share, pulled the silk loose. The scroll unfurled with a dry, rhythmic hiss, revealing columns of elegant Korean calligraphy intermingled with English legalities. It was more than a contract, it was a surrender of autonomy. "You understand what this is," Jae-Hyuk said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to emanate from the floorboards themselves. He didn't look at her. He looked at the ink. "This isn't a marriage of hearts. It is a merger of necessity. My family needs stability to pacify the elders. Your family needs the debt to vanish. Once we sign, you are no longer a private citizen of Ghana. You are an extension of the Seo Empire." Zariah stepped closer, her reflection shimmering in the black marble like a ghost. She reached out, her fingers hovering just inches above the parchment. She could feel the untouchable aura radiating from him, a cold heat that sought to make her hand tremble. She didn't let it. "I didn't travel across the world for a fairy tale, Jae-Hyuk," she replied, her voice steady and resonant. "I came for a solution. My people have a saying. When the king's house burns down, he builds a palace from the ashes. My house has burned. I am here to build." He finally looked up, his obsidian eyes searching hers for a hint of hesitation. Finding none, he slid a heavy silver-plated fountain pen toward her. Then let us set the rules of this house. Rule 1: loyalty is absolute. Any breath of betrayal is met with the end of the contract, and the end of the protection your mother currently enjoys. Zariah picked up the pen, the metal cool against her skin. Rule 2, she countered, her gaze locking onto his. I am not a guest in this penthouse, nor am I a servant. I am the queen of this contract. You manage the shadows of the streets. I manage the image of the throne. We are equals in power, if not in blood. A ghost of a smirk tugged at the corner of Jae-Hyuk's mouth, the first sign of humanity she had seen since her arrival. Rule 3, he added, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate whisper. No feelings. No romance. No soft expectations. We are a facade for the world to see. Inside these walls we are business partners. Outside we are a united front. But do not mistake the proximity for intimacy. My aura is a warning for a reason, Zariah. Do not try to fix what is intentionally broken. Zariah leaned over the table, the emerald velvet of her dress brushing against the marble. She didn't flinch at his warning. I have no interest in fixing a man who enjoys his own darkness, Prince. I am only interested in ensuring that darkness doesn't dim my light. With a swift, decisive motion, she pressed the pen to the parchment. Her signature was bold, a flourish of ink that claimed her space on the document. She then pressed her thumb into a small dish of red cinnabar paste and left a vivid, crimson print beside her name, the traditional mark of a blood vow. Jae-Hyuk took the pen from her, his fingers briefly brushing hers. The contact was like an electric shock, a spark of pure, unadulterated energy that made the air in the penthouse crackle. He signed his name with a jagged, aggressive script that seemed to bite into the paper. The vow was complete. The scroll lay between them, a binding testament to a union built on ambition rather than affection. The Untouchable Prince and the Ghanaian Queen stood in the silence of the high-rise, two titans who had traded their hearts for a crown. The city of Seoul glittered below them, indifferent to the war that had just been declared in the clouds. They were no longer strangers, but they were not yet lovers. They were the architects of a new, dangerous world, and the rules were written in ink and blood. The first morning in the penthouse arrived not with the warmth of the sun, but with the sterile white glow of Seoul's winter sky filtering through triple-paned glass. Zariah awoke in a bed that felt like an island of silk in a sea of cold marble. The silence was absolute, yet it didn't feel peaceful. It felt engineered. She rose, the emerald velvet of her gown replaced by a heavy silk robe the color of midnight, and began her slow, methodical exploration of the gilded cage. The penthouse was a masterclass in architectural intimidation. Every surface was too polished, every corner too sharp. As Zariah walked through the sprawling living area, her bare feet made no sound on the heated stone floors. She noticed quickly that the quiet luxury of the space was a mask for something far more clinical. In the recessed lighting of the hallways, she spotted the tiny, obsidian lenses of 360-degree cameras. They were everywhere, discreetly tucked into the molding, hidden within the minimalist art installations, and embedded in the frames of the doors. She wasn't just living in a home. She was living in a high-tech fortress. She pushed open a heavy door at the end of the north wing, expecting a library or a guest suite. Instead, she found a room bathed in the blue light of a dozen monitors. This was the nerve center of the Seo Empire. Data streams flickered across the screens, stock market fluctuations, encrypted messaging channels, and live feeds from the docks of Incheon. But it was the central monitor that caught her breath. It was a grid of the penthouse itself. She saw the empty kitchen, the darkened hallways, and the room she had just vacated. Jae-Hyuk wasn't just protecting himself from the world. He was monitoring his own isolation with the precision of a scientist. As she moved deeper into the shadows of the suite, the sense of loneliness became a physical weight. There were no photographs on the walls, no heirlooms, no books with broken spines or half-empty coffee mugs. The kitchen was a gleaming expanse of stainless steel and black granite that looked as if it had never felt the heat of a flame. It was a space designed for a man who didn't exist in the physical world, but in the digital and the tactical. She found herself in a long gallery that connected the living quarters to Jae-Hyuk's private wing. On the walls hung original works of modern art, abstract splashes of gray and black that felt like frozen screams. At the end of the hall stood a single pedestal holding a traditional Korean mask, its wooden face carved into a terrifying frozen grin. It was the only piece of heritage in the entire house, and it sat behind bulletproof glass. Zariah realized then that Jae-Hyuk's untouchable aura wasn't just a psychological trick, it was a lifestyle. He had built a world where he could see everything and touch nothing. The luxury was a distraction from the void. She reached out and touched a sleek, touch-sensitive panel on the wall, and a hidden door slid open to reveal a closet filled with identical white shirts and dark trousers. Everything was organized by shade and texture, a repetitive loop of perfection that bordered on madness. A soft chime echoed through the hallway, a notification that the elevator was ascending. Zariah didn't scramble to hide. She stood her ground in the center of the gallery, her silhouette framed by the cold blue light of the morning. When the doors opened, Jae-Hyuk stepped out, already armored in his quiet luxury suit. He stopped when he saw her standing among his shadows. His aura flared, that familiar cold pressure filling the space between them, but Zariah only tilted her head, her gaze sweeping from the hidden cameras to the man who controlled them. "You have a very beautiful prison, Jae-Hyuk," she said, her voice a calm ripple in the stagnant air. "But you forgot one thing when you brought me here." He narrowed his eyes, the obsidian depth of them shimmering with a hint of curiosity. "And what is that?" "A queen doesn't just live in a palace," Zariah replied, walking toward him until she was well within the kill zone of his presence. "She populates it. This house is a mausoleum of your own making. If you want me to reign beside you, you'll have to learn how to live in the light." Jae-Hyuk didn't answer, but for the first time he didn't look away either. The surveillance monitors in the other room continued their silent vigil, recording two titans standing in the gilded shadows of an empire built on silence. The war for the soul of the penthouse had begun, and Zariah was already rewriting the rules of the cage. The dining room was an extension of the penthouse's cold geometry, a long obsidian table that seemed to stretch into the dark, illuminated only by a low-hanging crystal chandelier that cast more shadows than light. Jae-Hyuk sat at the head, his presence a heavy anchor in the room. He was a master of controlled stillness, but the air around him hummed with that familiar predatory frequency. Across from him, Zariah sat in a gown of deep crimson silk, a sharp contrast to the monochrome sterility of the Seo Empire. The meal was served by silent staff who moved like ghosts, disappearing into the kitchen before the untouchable aura could cause their hands to shake. Between Jae-Hyuk and Zariah, the silence wasn't a void, it was a battlefield. Jae-Hyuk watched her with the clinical detachment of a man observing a specimen. "You haven't touched your wine," he remarked, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that vibrated through the fine crystal on the table. "Most find the silence in this room requires a certain level of sedation." Zariah lifted her glass, the liquid swirling like a dark garnet, but she didn't drink. She simply looked at him, her eyes steady and unblinking. "I don't need to dull my senses to endure you, Jae-Hyuk. I find the silence quite informative. It tells me that for all your cameras and all your guards, you are the only thing in this house you truly fear." The air in the room suddenly curdled. The atmospheric pressure dropped, and a visible ripple seemed to pass through the shadows in the corners. Jae-Hyuk's jaw tightened, his obsidian eyes darkening until the pupils were indistinguishable from the iris. The aura flared, no longer a passive weight but an active, aggressive force. It hit the table like a physical blow, causing the silver cutlery to rattle against the marble. "You speak as if you understand the darkness," Jae-Hyuk whispered, the sound carrying a serrated edge. "The women who were here before you, they understood. They saw the monster the Seo Clan spent 20 years perfecting. They felt the weight of a soul that has been hollowed out to make room for an empire. You are playing a dangerous game, Zariah. You think your royal blood makes you immune. I think your monster is a bored child," Zariah countered, her voice remaining smooth and resonant, a silken thread in a room full of knives. She leaned forward, deep into the kill zone of his presence where the air was cold enough to frost the lungs. "You use this aura to keep the world at bay because you're terrified that if someone actually looked at you, they'd find a man instead of a legend. You're not untouchable, Jae-Hyuk. You're just lonely." Jae-Hyuk surged to his feet, the motion so sudden and violent that his chair skidded across the marble with a harsh metallic scream. He slammed his palms onto the table, leaning over her, his face inches from hers. The full force of his killing intent erupted, A psychic storm that would have sent a lesser person into cardiac arrest. The lights flickered, and the temperature in the room plummeted. In the dim light, his features seemed to shift, his eyes glowing with a terrifying primal intensity. This was the side of the prince that broke minds, the raw, unfiltered power of the Dragon King. He waited for her to scream. He waited for her to recoil in horror, to beg for the elevator doors to open. Instead, a low melodic sound began to vibrate in the air. It took Jae-Hyuk a heartbeat to realize what it was. Zariah was laughing. It wasn't a mocking laugh, nor was it hysterical. It was the rich, genuine sound of a woman who had found something genuinely amusing. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on his monster mask, her expression one of pure, unadulterated delight. "Is that it?" she asked, her voice breathless with amusement. "Is this the great terror of Seoul? A man who makes the lights flicker when he's offended? Jae-Hyuk, I have stood in the middle of a collapsing dynasty. I have stared down men who intended to sell my mother for the price of a debt. Your aura is just a temper tantrum in a designer suit." The storm didn't just stop. It collapsed. The pressure in the room vanished, replaced by a stunned, hollow silence. Jae-Hyuk remained frozen, his hands still pressed against the table, his chest heaving. No one had ever laughed at him. No one had ever looked at the abyss he projected and found it small. The first crack had appeared in the prince's armor. It wasn't caused by a strike, but by a smile. "The dinner was excellent," Zariah said, standing up with a regal poise that made the massive room seem to shrink around her. She reached out and for a fleeting second, her fingers brushed the sleeve of his white shirt, the first time she had intentionally entered his physical space. "But if you want to truly frighten me, Jae-Hyuk, you'll have to try being honest. That is much more terrifying than being a monster." She turned and walked away, her heels clicking a steady, victorious rhythm on the marble. Jae-Hyuk stood alone in the dark, the monitors in the other room recording his stillness. For the first time in his life, the untouchable prince felt exposed. The Ghanaian queen hadn't just survived the night, she had begun to dismantle his throne. The stillness of the penthouse was broken not by a sound, but by a sudden shift in the air. A violent ripple that disrupted the stagnant weight of Jae-Hyuk's presence. It was 3 a.m, the hour when the city's neon lights flickered like dying stars. Zariah was in the kitchen, her bare feet silent on the black granite, when the digital chime of the security system was cut short by a localized electromagnetic pulse. The monitor she had discovered days earlier went dark, and the gilded cage was plunged into a suffocating artificial midnight. She didn't reach for a light. Her eyes had long ago adapted to the shadows of high-stakes living. From the darkness of the gallery, she heard the soft, pressurized hiss of a glass cutter, and the heavy thud of a boot hitting marble. They weren't coming for her. In the hierarchy of this house, she was a commodity, but Jae-Hyuk was a target. Jae-Hyuk emerged from his wing, a ghostly figure in his white dress shirt, his jaw set in a line of grim anticipation. Even in the dark, his aura was a palpable force, but as the 3 intruders stepped into the foyer, armored in tactical gear and wielding silenced submachine guns, the prince's psychological edge faltered. Auras worked on the fearful, but these men were professionals, their minds dulled by adrenaline and greed. For the first time, Jae-Hyuk's untouchable nature was a liability. He had spent so long pushing people away that he was now entirely alone in the face of literal steel. The lead assassin raised his weapon, the barrel leveling at Jae-Hyuk's chest. The prince stood frozen, his hands empty, his primary weapon of intimidation failing against the cold reality of a trigger pull. Then the shadows behind the kitchen island moved. Zariah didn't scream. She didn't panic. She moved with the predatory economy of a woman who had survived the back alleys of Accra's debt wars. Before the lead gunman could fire, a heavy decorative brass mortar from the kitchen counter whistled through the air, striking him squarely in the temple with a sickening crack. As he crumpled, Zariah closed the distance. She was a blur of crimson silk and lethal intent. The second intruder swung his weapon toward the flash of red, but Zariah was already beneath his guard. She didn't fight like a trained soldier. She fought like a survivor who knew that mercy was a luxury of the rich. She drove her heel into the man's kneecap with a sound like a breaking branch, and as he doubled over, she used the momentum to drive a sharpened steel oyster shucker, the most dangerous tool in the kitchen, into the gap of his tactical vest. The third man, panicked by the sudden eruption of violence from an unexpected source, turned his gun toward Zariah. "The girl!" he hissed, his finger tightening on the trigger. Jae-Hyuk finally snapped out of his trance. Seeing Zariah in the line of fire acted as a catalyst, focusing his amorphous aura into a singular, sharp point of rage. He lunged, his athletic build closing the gap in 2 strides. He didn't just strike the man. He dismantled him, his movements a blur of refined violence that mirrored the raw aggression Zariah had unleashed. Within seconds, the penthouse returned to its heavy, ringing silence. The only sound was the ragged breathing of 2 survivors. The black marble was no longer pristine. A dark, viscous stain spread across the floor, blood that didn't belong to the residents. Jae-Hyuk stood over the last intruder, his knuckles split, his white shirt splattered with crimson. His aura was still roiling, a dark storm of killing intent that usually sent people running for their lives. He turned to Zariah, expecting to see the terror he had seen in every other woman. He expected her to be repulsed by the blood on his hands or the violence in his eyes. Instead, Zariah stood by the kitchen island, calmly wiping the oyster shucker with a linen towel. Her hair was still perfectly sleek, her expression as serene as if she had just finished a business meeting. She looked at the bodies on the floor, then up at the untouchable prince. "You were slow, Jae-Hyuk," she said, her voice a cool, steady melody in the dark. She walked toward him, stepping over the fallen men without a second glance, and stopped within his personal space. "Your aura is good for scaring children and socialites, but it doesn't stop a bullet. If you want to keep this throne, you'd better remember that the queen knows how to handle the dirt so you don't have to." Jae-Hyuk stared at her, the obsidian depths of his eyes flickering with something new. It wasn't just shock, it was a profound, terrifying recognition. He had spent his life looking for someone who could withstand his darkness, but he had found something far more dangerous. A woman who possessed a darkness that rivaled his own. For the first time since the Mafia Vow was signed, the prince didn't just see a partner. He saw a protector. And as they stood together in the blood-stained penthouse, the untouchable aura finally began to shift, moving from a wall of isolation to a shield that encompassed them both. The war for Seoul had just become a much more violent affair, and the queen had proven she was the deadliest piece on the board. The blood on the marble was still being scrubbed away by a silent, terrified cleaning crew when Jae-Hyuk retreated to the one room in the penthouse Zariah had never been allowed to enter. It was a small windowless chamber tucked behind the high-tech server room, devoid of quiet luxury. No silk, no marble, no designer labels. Just cold industrial concrete and a single low-hanging bulb that hummed with a sickly yellow light. Zariah didn't knock. She followed the scent of copper and the heavy vibrating thrum of his aura, which was now erratic and jagged, like a dying heartbeat. She found him sitting on a wooden stool, his head in his hands, his white shirt ruined. He looked less like a prince and more like a ghost haunted by its own haunting. "The elders don't just want me dead, Zariah," he said, his voice barely a whisper, echoing off the bare walls. "They want me to be exactly what I am. A weapon. A monster. They spent 20 years making sure I couldn't be anything else." He stood up and turned his back to her, pulling the ruined shirt from his shoulders. Zariah's breath hitched, not in fear, but in a sudden sharp empathy that felt like a blade. His back was a map of old silvered scars, a lattice of pain that told a story of training sessions that were nothing more than institutionalized torture. The Seo Clan hadn't just raised him. They had broken him and glued the pieces back together with ice and steel. The aura. The killing intent that everyone runs from, he continued, his voice trembling for the first time. It wasn't a gift. It was a survival instinct. When I was a child locked in a room similar to this one for days without food, I learned that if I projected enough hate, enough sheer raw terror, the guards would stop touching me. They would stop the lessons. My soul became a wall so that my body could survive. Zariah stepped into the room, her emerald robe trailing on the concrete. The closer she got, the more the air began to vibrate with his agony. It was like walking into a storm of static and glass shards. This was the ghost of the Seo Clan. The little boy who had been forced to turn his heart into a weapon just to see the next sunrise. "You think the other wives ran because of what I might do to them," Jae-Hyuk said, turning to face her, his eyes glassy and dark. "They ran because of what I am. When I'm near someone, they feel the 20 years of torture I carry. They feel the scream I've been holding in since I was 6 years old. No one can breathe in here, Zariah. Even the air is traumatized. He braced himself for her to turn and walk away. He had given her the ultimate truth, the secret behind the untouchable mask, expecting the final rejection. He waited for the revulsion to set in, for the queen to realize that her king was nothing more than a collection of broken bones and psychological scars. Instead, Zariah did something that no one in Seoul, and perhaps no one in the world, had ever dared to do. She walked through the wall of his aura, ignoring the way it made her skin crawl and her heart hammer against her ribs. She reached out and placed her warm, radiant palm directly against his scarred chest, right over his heart. The aura flared, a desperate, final attempt to push her away, to protect the ghost from the pain of being seen. The lights in the small room flickered and buzzed, but Zariah didn't flinch. She leaned in until her forehead rested against his, her deep skin a stark, beautiful contrast to his pale, sweat-streaked face. A ghost can only haunt a house that is empty, Jae-Hyuk, she whispered, her voice a steady, grounding anchor in the middle of his storm. But I am here now. And I am not afraid of your shadows. I come from a land where we honor the ancestors and the scars they carry. You aren't a monster. You're just a survivor who hasn't realized the war is over. For the first time in 20 years, the atmospheric pressure in the room began to equalize. The heavy, suffocating weight of his presence didn't vanish, but it softened, shifting from a weapon of war into a sigh of relief. Jae-Hyuk slumped forward, his weight leaning into her, his hands gripping her silk-covered arms as if she were the only thing keeping him from dissolving into the concrete. The Prince of Silence finally let out the breath he had been holding since childhood. In the dim, sickly light of the concrete room, the ghost of the Seo clan was laid to rest, and in its place something new began to stir. They were still two broken people in a gilded cage, but as Zariah held him, the Mafia vow they had signed felt less like a contract and more like a lifeline. The Untouchable Prince had been touched, and the queen had found the soul beneath the scars. The Grand Hyatt Seoul was a fortress of glass and gold, crawling with the city's most dangerous elites. Tonight was the anniversary of the Seo Foundation, a high-stakes masquerade where the masks were made of silk, and the knives were hidden behind smiles. Jae-Hyuk stood in the center of the ballroom, a statue in a charcoal tuxedo, his jawline like a jagged cliff. Around him the untouchable aura was a visible shimmer in the air, a wall of psychic static that kept the circling predators at a 10-foot distance. Beside him, Zariah was a vision of defiant splendor. She wore a gown of molten gold that seemed to drink the light of the chandeliers, her dark skin glowing with the radiance of a solar eclipse. She didn't just walk beside him, she anchored him. Her hand was tucked firmly into the crook of his arm, her thumb rhythmically stroking the fabric of his sleeve. A silent, grounding pulse that kept the ghost within him from screaming. Look at them, Jae-Hyuk murmured, his voice a low vibration that only she could hear. They aren't here to celebrate. They're here for the circus. They're waiting for the monster to slip. Then let's give them a masterclass in royalty instead, Zariah replied, her gaze sweeping the room with the cool indifference of a lioness. The strategy of the Seo elders was clear. They didn't use guns here, they used stimuli. As the couple moved toward the center of the dance floor, the sensory assault began. High-frequency ultrasonic hums, imperceptible to most but agonizing to Jae-Hyuk's heightened, trauma-tuned senses, began to vibrate through the hidden speakers. The lighting shifted into a rhythmic, strobing pulse designed to trigger his fight-or-flight response. Then came the final move. A group of rival family heirs, led by the sneering director Park, crowded into Jae-Hyuk's personal space. They intentionally breached the killing intent zone, their laughter loud and abrasive, their bodies jostling him with calculated disrespect. Is the prince feeling unwell? Park sneered, leaning in until his wine-scented breath hit Jae-Hyuk's face. You look a bit unstable tonight. Perhaps the Ghanaian sun has made your shadow go soft. Jae-Hyuk's pupils dilated until his eyes were total obsidian. The air in the ballroom began to chill, a sudden unnatural draft whistling through the silk hangings. The fine crystal glasses in the hands of the nearby socialites began to vibrate, a low, ominous hum rising from the floorboards. The untouchable aura was transforming, darkening into the primal storm that usually preceded a massacre. The monster was clawing at the back of his throat, desperate to shatter the room. The elders smiled behind their champagne flutes. They wanted the outburst. They wanted a public breakdown that would justify stripping him of his title and committing him to a sanitarium. Zariah felt the vibration in his arm turn into a violent tremor. She didn't pull away. She didn't call for security. Instead, she stepped directly in front of him, breaking his line of sight with Director Park. She placed both of her hands on Jae-Hyuk's cheeks, her warm mahogany skin a startling contrast to his deathly pale face. The killing intent hit her like a physical gale, tossing her hair and chilling her bones, but she didn't flinch. She leaned in, pressing her forehead against his, her voice a silken command that cut through the static of his panic. Jae-Hyuk, look at me, she whispered. The storm is outside. And here there is only us. You are the king, and I am the queen, and these people are nothing but dust on your throne. Breathe for me. Give me the silence, not the storm. The room went deathly quiet as the elite watched the impossible. No one touched the prince. No one survived that close to the ghost. But as Zariah held him, the flickering lights stabilized. The vibrating crystal went still. The suffocating weight of his presence didn't vanish, but it folded inward, wrapping around the two of them like a protective cloak. Jae-Hyuk's chest heaved once, a long shuddering exhale, and then his eyes cleared. He looked down at Zariah, his features softening from a mask of ice into the face of a man who had finally found his North Star. He turned back to Director Park, who was now stumbling backward, his face drained of color. Jae-Hyuk didn't growl. He didn't strike. He simply smiled. A cold, predatory expression of absolute control that was far more terrifying than any monster. You were saying, Director? Jae-Hyuk asked, his voice smooth and deadly. Or have you forgotten how to speak in the presence of your betters? The elder's smiles vanished. The untouchable prince hadn't just been tamed. He had been sharpened. As the music resumed, Zariah led him into a waltz, their movements a seamless display of power and grace. They moved as one entity, a transnational dynasty that had just proven it could withstand any storm the city of Seoul could throw at it. The queen had held the line, and the prince had finally found a reason to stay in the light. The aftermath of the gala felt like the drawing of a long-awaited breath, but for the Seo elders, it was the sounding of a death knell. They retreated to the inner sanctum, a subterranean boardroom beneath a traditional tea house in Insadong, where the smell of old wood and ancient greed hung heavy. They sat in a circle of shadow, 5 men who had controlled the flow of blood and currency in Seoul for 40 years, convinced that Zariah was merely a fortunate fluke, a temporary stabilizer they could now discard. They did not expect the doors to slide open for her. Zariah entered alone. She had traded the gold gown for a tailored suit of charcoal wool, her hair pulled back so tightly it gave her features the sharpness of a spearhead. She didn't wait for an invitation to sit. She walked to the head of the table, the place reserved for the absent Jae-Hyuk, and placed the black ribbon scroll upon the wood with a resonant thud. The prince is occupied with the restructuring of the Gangnam territories, she said, her voice a cool, low-frequency hum that vibrated the tea in their porcelain cups. I am here to discuss the sunset of your influence. The oldest among them, a man whose face was a roadmap of 80 years of malice, let out a dry, rattling laugh. You were bought to be a silencer for his madness, girl. You are a contract, not a shareholder. Do not mistake a walk on the prince's arm for a seat at this table. Zariah didn't move. She didn't raise her voice. She simply reached into her leather portfolio and began sliding documents across the table. Not Korean bank statements, but international ledger entries from West African shipping conglomerates and Ghanaian gold refineries. While you were busy trying to trigger my husband's instability with cheap lights and high-frequency hums, Zariah began, her gaze locking onto each man with predatory precision, I was busy looking at your supply chains. You've spent decades funneling the Seo family's liquid assets into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands to avoid the prince's oversight. Accounts that, as of 4 o'clock this morning, have been frozen by the Ghanaian Central Bank under suspicion of financing illicit mining operations in the Ashanti region. The room went deathly still. The elders looked at the papers, their hands beginning to tremble. They had underestimated her, seeing only a bought bride from a distance, failing to realize that Zariah Nyamekye Agyeman came from a line of merchants and monarchs who had mastered the art of the trade before Seoul, had even seen its first skyscraper. You see, Zariah continued, leaning forward until the soft glow of the hanging lantern illuminated the gold studs in her ears. You thought you were bringing a victim into this house to distract the monster. But you brought in a queen who knows exactly how to starve a kingdom. I have spent the last 72 hours rerouting the Seo shipping lanes through Accra. Your shells are empty. Your influence is a ghost. Director Park, who had slunk into the room behind the elders, stepped forward, his face flushed with rage. You can't do this. Jae-Hyuk would never allow a foreigner to. Jae-Hyuk, Zariah interrupted, her voice turning to ice, is the one who gave me the keys to your digital vaults. He grew tired of being your weapon, so he decided to make me your judge. She stood up, the movement as regal and final as a closing curtain. Here is the Queen's gambit. You will sign over your remaining voting shares to the prince's private trust. In exchange, I will ensure the Ghanaian authorities find administrative errors in your frozen accounts, allowing you to retire to your villas with enough to live on. If you refuse, I will let the prince enter this room. And we all know that without my silencing influence, his aura tends to be lethal. The silence that followed was the sound of an empire shifting on its axis. One by one, the men who had tortured a child and called it training reached for their pens. They signed not out of loyalty, but out of the sheer primal terror that Zariah had cultivated, not with a curse but with a balance sheet. As Zariah walked out of the tea house and into the crisp morning air of Seoul, she saw the black Mercedes waiting. Jae-Hyuk stood by the door, his untouchable aura now a calm protective shroud. He didn't ask what had happened. He saw the way she carried herself, the poise, the gravity, the victory. The elders had wanted a bride to break the prince. Instead, they had given him a queen who had broken the board. The contract was no longer about survival. It was about the beginning of a dynasty. Zariah looked at the city she now partially owned and realized that for the first time in her life, the debt wasn't just paid. The world was finally starting to owe her. The 40th floor balcony of the Latte World Tower was no longer a platform of isolation, but a summit. The winter air of Seoul remained sharp, but it didn't bite as it once had. The wind seemed to bow as it moved around the two figures standing against the glass railing. Below them, the city was a sea of sapphire and diamond lights, a sprawling grid of millions of lives, all of which were now touched by the shadow of the Seo Empire. Jae-Hyuk stood with his hands resting on the cold steel, his white shirt open at the collar, his untouchable aura radiating softly. It was no longer a jagged weapon of defense, but a warm low-frequency hum that wrapped around the balcony like a fortress wall. He looked at the city he had been raised to rule through fear, and for the first time, he didn't feel like a ghost haunting his own life. Zariah moved toward him, her emerald velvet gown catching the moonlight. She didn't stop at the edge of his presence. She merged with it. She stepped into his space, her shoulder brushing his, her presence the grounding wire that turned his static into a steady current. In her hand she held a small silver lighter. In the other, the ancient parchment scroll, the Mafia Vow, that had brought her across the ocean. The elders are gone, she said, her voice a silken melody that carried over the hum of the city. The accounts are secured. The debt that brought me here is a footnote in a history book that has already been closed. We have everything we were promised. Jae-Hyuk turned to look at her. The obsidian depths of his eyes were no longer hollow. They were filled with a terrifying, beautiful clarity. He reached out and took the scroll from her, his fingers steady. This paper was a cage, he murmured, his voice a low vibration. It was the only way I knew how to keep someone near me without breaking them. I thought I needed a contract to ensure I wouldn't be alone. A queen doesn't stay because of a contract, Jae-Hyuk, Zariah replied, her gaze locking onto his. She stays because the throne is better with a king who knows her worth. With a single decisive flick, Jae-Hyuk ignited the lighter. The flame was a tiny dancing spark in the vast dark of the Seoul night. He touched the fire to the edge of the parchment. They watched together as the ink, the signatures, the thumbprints, the rules of no feelings, began to curl and blacken. The fire climbed the vellum, consuming the quiet luxury restrictions and the transactional coldness that had defined their first nights in the penthouse. As the ash caught the wind and scattered like dark snow over the city, the heavy atmospheric pressure that had always defined Jae-Hyuk's life finally broke. The silence that followed wasn't the silence of a mausoleum. It was the silence of a new beginning. Jae-Hyuk reached out, his hand sliding behind Zariah's neck, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that would have been impossible weeks ago. He didn't have to worry about his killing intent anymore. The ghost had been silenced by a woman who refused to run. The world still sees a monster and a bought bride, Jae-Hyuk whispered, leaning in until their breaths mingled in the cold air. Let them, Zariah said, a regal smile touching her lips. By the time they realize the monster has a heart and the bride has a crown, we will already be reigning over the ruins of their expectations. He kissed her then, a slow sovereign seal of a bond that no longer needed a ribbon or a seal. It was a kiss that tasted of African gold and Korean steel, of survival and the intoxicating scent of a victory won in the dark. The untouchable prince had been claimed, and the Ghanaian queen had found a kingdom that was finally worthy of her poise. As they stood on the balcony, framed by the warm chandelier light behind them and the infinite blue night before them, they were no longer two broken people in a gilded cage. They were a dynasty of two, a transnational empire built on the ashes of their trauma. Two thrones had become one, and as the lights of Seoul glittered beneath them, the city finally understood. The dragon had found his queen, and the war was over.